During this time of year, my family and I celebrate Advent. It's just a time of preparation and waiting as we kind of prepare for Christmas and for Christ's second coming. So we get ready to celebrate his first coming and then prepare for him to come again. So I decided, kind of on a whim, to create this Advent painting, and I thought I would share it with you. Now, if you are not comfortable with drawing and really you just want to play around with painting and maybe learn more about the symbolism of Advent and the Advent candles, then I do have a printable for you down below. Otherwise, I just kind of looked at a couple of different pictures and kind of made it up as I went, and kind of trying to pull in some of my favorite aspects of Advent, the symbolism behind these candles, in order to create a composition that I really found pleasing and meaningful. Now that our illustration is complete, I'm going to lighten the whole thing with this kneaded eraser. You just kind of roll it across the top, and that will pick up a lot of the graphite that you have laid down and lighten everything without completely losing the lines that you have down. So something like a white eraser or even a gummy eraser will pick up a lot more, and kind of the intention is to completely clean your piece or your canvas or your paper. But our goal right now is just to lighten it. I don't want any graphite getting into my paint, and I don't want it distracting from the paint that I lay down. So I'm just lightening everything real quick before we get started with the actual paint. Now it is time to kind of figure out what my palette is going to be. I'm starting with some yellow ochre, and I'm going to add a little bit of black to that. I really want to just desaturate that a little bit. I want the center candle, the Christ candle, to be a nice warm ivory color, but I don't want, I don't want it to be too warm. I still want it to have that white quality, but I do want some warmth there. So I'm just testing it out here. The big reason why I was kind of doing this test is because I wasn't sure about the purple. So I'm starting with Deep Scarlet by Daniel Smith, which is probably my favorite red. It is like my Christmas red. And so if I'm doing a Christmas painting, I'm going to be pulling from that red. It is one of the few paints that I will use straight from the tube without mixing with anything for something like this. So I decided to pull it through and just see kind of if I could just add a little bit of white to it so that I would have kind of that creaminess, if that would be a good pink for my Advent candle collection, or if I needed to add a little bit of warmth to it. I tend to prefer my reds or my pinks to be a little bit on the warm side. That's just a personal preference thing, but I always like kind of those peachy pinks. So I did decide to add a little bit of the lemon yellow, and decided to just kind of see how that dries. I didn't want to have too orangey, but I ended up really liking that. Next, I took that same red, that same deep scarlet, which is fairly similar to alizarin crimson. So if you don't have deep scarlet, don't worry about it. And I'm adding a little bit of indigo to it. I'm trying to see what we should do for our purple. Now, if you are pulling paints right now, don't pull the deep indigo. I ended up not using it for this piece, but I did want to kind of test it out. It's one of my favorite deep blues. It's very rich. It's very, very saturated. But my original plan for this painting has been to do an indigo background and kind of have the candles glowing. So I thought I like to reuse the paints that I am planning to use on a canvas, and kind of repeat them elsewhere. And so I thought, well, it would be nice if I could reuse the same red and the same blue. I didn't like it though. It was a little bit too desaturated, a little bit too muted. However, ultramarine mixed with that deep scarlet had the right purple tone that I was going for. It felt a little bit more of like a medium tone purple and not as much of kind of the muted red purple. And that was a little bit closer to what I was going for. Now for the wreath itself, again, I'm trying to kind of repeat some colors here. So I pulled in some yellow ochre. I'm going to be working with sap green quite a bit. I'm just trying to find the right shade of green. Because I have a lot of other colors going on, I don't want it to be too bright or to compete with what's already happening. So I don't know, I'm trying to find like a good olivey tone, a little bit more of a mid-tone. So I'm mixing in a little bit of that indigo and deep scarlet mix in there just to see if that would desaturate it enough. Is that kind of what I'm going for? I'm just kind of pulling from my palette, and I end up kind of going just off the cuff when I'm actually doing the painting, but I do like to have a plan just to see, do I prefer a brighter tone with this, or do I prefer like a deeper tone, or something a little bit more muted? Just having that little bit of a plan can help me to move forward with a little bit more confidence. So I started to pull in a little bit more of the indigo, and I decided that was kind of too blue. But I was just playing around with it, seeing what works. And then again, my initial plan was to have this deep indigo background. I might still go back and kind of add that in. For this tutorial, I'm not including it because right now the piece is sitting next to me. It does not have the deep indigo background. I just decided to keep it as it was, but I did like the idea, and I did want to have a plan overall just to make sure that my idea wasn't too crazy. So I liked how the colors worked together. If you're planning to have something really bold like this deep indigo background, just make sure that everything that you're working with doesn't compete or clash with it. And by compete, I mean like that they're not all the same value, or which is how light or dark something is, or not the same saturation. And so they're not all either all muted or all bright. It's good to have a little bit of that variety in there. And then just playing around with the kind of candle tones. I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to go super bright with that. I do end up deciding to go in a more bright direction, but just kind of testing things out. I want to have that on hand so that as I'm mixing colors for the actual painting process, again, I can just move forward very confidently. And if I decide to make a change to the plan, I can still look back and see, okay, yeah, this is the right move. To start our painting, I'm using a quill brush. Let me grab it. It is a size 6. This is from Princeton Neptune. So a size 6 quill brush. It is massive. It is a very thirsty brush, which is kind of what I was going for. I really wanted the edges that I was adding, there's these shadows of this warmer tone. I wanted that to be really soft. I didn't want to have really hard edges, and so I'm pulling this brush in. It's usually what I use if I'm doing like landscapes or a large wash. So if I did do the indigo background, I would probably be using a brush like this, just to apply a lot of pigment quickly. I do not think that you need to use this brush. I was, again, just enjoying myself and kind of going off of the seat of my pants. And so I really just enjoyed kind of playing around with this. So I'm kind of adding a lot of pigment in. Sorry, the focus will reset in just a moment. I'm adding pigment in. I have a large wet area because of that large barrel on the quill brush itself. So I'm just kind of tapping color to the outside in order to get that modeling where everything appears to be nice and round. But I also have this nice sharp tip or point at the edge of this brush, so I am able to apply some paint a little bit more delicately or precisely. So I'm applying these to the exterior, this color, and to the base, just to kind of create a natural modeling or shading to show that it is a cylinder, and to show that there is the wreath kind of covering different areas and overlapping the candle at the very base. Also, the base is the farthest away from the light source, which is kind of the candles, or the flame itself. And so I want the shadows to be deepest, farthest away from that. And I'm just tapping color in slowly. This section that I'm working on is already wet, which will create a nice soft transition. So those harsh lines, you can see I'm going in just to make sure that they're nice and soft. This is a damp brush. Damp, no pigment on it. It is a round, I believe it's a size 10 brush, and I'm just kind of blending that in. By doing that kind of at the very edges, on, again, kind of damp paper already, not wet, like not a soaking wet paper, but damp, will kind of help to create those softer transitions, so I can have that nice smooth gradient without kind of doing a lot of extra work, really. This white candle that I'm painting right now, it is the Christ candle. It is the one that is lit on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, depending on your tradition. And it is white to represent the light and purity and the victory that came when Christ came to earth as a baby. All right, if you know me very well at all, you know I couldn't leave that peachy pink on my palette for one more minute without diving into it. So I did end up using our deep scarlet and a little bit of that lemon yellow. I might have added a little bit of white, but I can't remember offhand. I don't think that you need to add it. You could kind of lighten it by having more water mixed in with your paint and have less pigment. So just kind of having that balance here. But I did skip ahead to what is considered the third candle, or the shepherd's candle. So you light 2 purple ones, and then the third week you light the shepherd's candle. And this candle represents joy, which if you're somebody who loves a peachy pink color like I do, then that makes perfect sense. This is often called the shepherd's candle, and it just kind of calls us back to remember the shepherd's great joy when the angels came and announced that Jesus had been born. And especially for a shepherd, they were kind of considered of a lower class. The fact that the angels came to tell them and not, didn't go to the priest, didn't go to, somebody who was a leader in the town, they didn't go to a ruler, they came to these shepherds, again, these kind of lowly people. And it just kind of helped to reiterate that Christ came for everybody. He came to, help lift up the humble and even unimportant people as well. So I'm just kind of adding this pink in, kind of back to the technique and less about the symbolism. I'm just dipping in more and more of this pigment. I did decide to add a little bit of the kind of creamy color that I used for the Christ candle, and I'm just adding that at the base to help add a shadow. Now, in order to get a highlight, I took a clean brush. It's wet. It's the same brush I've been working with, but I removed the excess water and I'm pulling it through the center of the candle just to kind of pick up some of this pigment. That will help, again, to create that kind of gradient, that modeling that we're working on, and to again, give that 3D effect. This will dry. It'll kind of have a smoother transition and kind of fill in some more of that space. But by just kind of picking up some of the paint that I've laid down, that will help to create a softer transition than if I had just left a blank space. I'm going to allow that pink candle to dry. We might add a little bit more of a shadow later on, but I first want to kind of go in on the full first pass of everything. So I'm moving on to this purple candle. Again, we used deep scarlet and ultramarine blue in order to get this kind of mid-tone purple color. And I'm just applying that full wash all the way down. So the purple symbolizes waiting and also kind of points to the royalty. It's considered a royal color from back when they used to have to, purple was kind of a hard color to come by because they would crush snail shells in order to get it. And so it was reserved for the royalty. It was a very smelly process. Nobody wanted to do it. And so if you did have it, it was considered kind of a hot commodity. So it was reserved for the royalty, and so it's also used here. It also symbolizes kind of waiting, and so it's also used for the Lenten season. They'll use purple, and so some traditions I recently learned this year are switching to more of a blue candle just to differentiate it from Lent, but I'm sticking with the tradition. That's kind of what I grew up with, so I'm using purple here. And I think that it still applies. We are still kind of in a season of waiting and preparing our hearts. And again here, just like with the pink candle, I'm just going through and I'm pulling up some of this color at the very center. I've tapped extra down at the bottom to have that shadow there, and I'm still adding some more in, but by kind of pulling from that center, it will help to give it a rounded effect without having it be too stark. Now, if you are painting this yourself, I actually recommend working from the opposite side of your dominant hand and not doing what I'm doing and trying to kind of move over your painting. I'm not really even sure why I did it, but it's what happened. It tends to be what I always do. You can work around it, but I do recommend working away from your dominant hand so that you are not kind of trying to work over and hover your hand over what you've already painted. It is dry. I decided to take a little break and allow it to dry because I was going to be faced with a problem. So anyway, I hope that you don't mind me jumping back and forth from symbolism to painting techniques. I find symbolism in artwork fascinating. Symbolism used to be used to help tell the story, especially when people were largely illiterate. Stained glass windows in churches would help to share the Bible stories for people who had never read the Bible before, especially when Bibles were only in Latin and not everybody spoke Latin. So there's just so much symbolism in art, and that I've learned through art history that I just find it really interesting. So I am kind of jumping back and forth here. Hopefully that's okay. But it's kind of the same technique with each of the candles. I'm going through, I'm adding a lot of pigment, kind of a full wash to the whole piece, and then I'm tapping in excess color to the base, picking up a little bit to kind of show how it's modeling. I don't know why it's zoomed in on my hand here, but that's kind of the technique that I'm going to be using for all of these pieces. So the first purple candle that would be lit on the first Sunday of Advent. So Advent is the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. So that first candle represents hope. And it's just where we kind of prepare our hearts, and we have the hope, meaning not as much like the wishing hope, but hoping with confidence, like knowing that this is coming and looking forward to it. And so we're filled with that hope. It's called the prophet's candle. So again, we're looking forward. We often read from Isaiah, which prophesies about the coming Messiah. The second candle, also purple, represents faith. It's called the Bethlehem candle. And it's, again, more prophecy, talking about the birthplace of King David. And it symbolizes, again, more preparation for the coming king. Third one is the pink one. And then the fourth candle, so the last Sunday before Christmas, is also purple, and it's called the peace candle or the angel's candle. So while I don't know the story of why it's called the angel's candle, I do know that the peace comes from Christ being the Prince of Peace. Jesus came to bring peace and restore peace to the world that was there at creation, but we had separation from God because of sin. And he came to kind of bring that back together. So we now have a way, again, to get back to Christ. Now back to my color mixing. I'm using sap green. I did pull in some of our not raw sienna. That's a different video that will be coming soon. I pulled in deep scarlet and some ultramarine. I think I tried a little bit of the yellow ochre, but I didn't end up sticking with that. I pretty much just used different mixes of the sap green, deep scarlet, and ultramarine blue, and just kind of played around with it in order to get the underlying hue that I was going for. So if I wanted something a little bit more cool, I went towards the ultramarine. If I wanted something a little warmer, I added more of that deep scarlet. The deep scarlet really mixed with the sap green, gave me a nice olive green tone. And so if I wanted it to have a little bit more of that yellow mixed in, I would kind of pull that in a little bit more. Now I'm taking my size 10 round, and again, you don't have to use this brush necessarily. I would probably go with a smaller brush, but before this I was painting larger elements, so it's kind of the brush that's just at my fingertips at the moment. I do end up switching to, I believe, a 6, or I might use an 8 from this brush line, and that would probably be what I would stick with the most if I were to do it again. But I'm just applying a quick wash over everything. I decided not to leave any very stark white highlights. Sometimes I do, but I really wanted this to kind of be more of a garnish, more of something. It's an added element. It's not going to steal the show. It kind of plays up everything. It complements everything, but it's not going to be a huge focal point. At least that is not the intention. We'll see how this ends up. The wreath is symbolic. It represents kind of the unending covenant of God and his unending nature. So similar to a wedding ring, where that is that circular ring that you place on your finger, it represents the eternity and the eternal quality of your covenant. Same thing with the wreath. So God's promises are unending and his qualities will never change. So he is unchanging. The reason that I decided to use holly, which, to be honest, I do not like drawing. It's so angular. I like to have a lot of movement and kind of have a dance with my flowers. And it's really hard to get kind of a ballet type style feel and dance from very angular pointed leaves, but I did want to stick with it because I was doing a little bit of research and I found that the reason that holly is symbolic, especially around Christmas time, is because it points to the crown of thorns that Christ will eventually wear. And I loved kind of the juxtaposition of, like pointing towards his first coming and kind of remembering that and the humility, the joy, and everything that comes with that, but also pointing to why he came. Because if he didn't come, like he came as a baby, but if he didn't come to die and to save us, then there's not really a good reason for him to have come. It's definitely not as meaningful, as special, or as significant for us that he came if he doesn't end up kind of becoming our savior. And so I really loved having the symbolism of, like we're celebrating his first coming, kind of looking forward with an anticipation. And then we're acknowledging why we even care, because it doesn't really matter if he came if he didn't do so much for us, if he didn't pay our price, pay the penalty that we deserved, if he didn't die in our place, if he didn't cover our sins. And so as a Christian, I love having these two elements together where it's the symbolism of being excited about him coming, but then also acknowledging why it matters. All right, switching back to the actual artwork. Sorry, I just love the power of symbolism in artwork. It can be a great way to tell a story, especially if you have a story to tell. Just learning about the symbolism, what colors mean, etc. But back to the actual painting. Let me pull my brush out. I am using a round Princeton Heritage brush, size 3, and I'm going in and I'm adding these details. I'm starting with the leaves way in the back, again, because I'm planning to add a dark indigo background. I want to use the aerial perspective properly, so everything that goes back should be darker. So everything that is in the back should have a lower contrast than the things in the front to the background. So I'm adding just more of that darker color. I also added a little bit more of our ultramarine blue in order to kind of help it to fall back. So cool colors will automatically kind of fall back on the page, and warm colors kind of come towards us. They demand our attention a little bit more. I added a little bit of red in there because it was just a little too blue, and that helped to kind of bring it back, and so that it wasn't so blue, so icy. And this was not a fast process, but I'm just going one leaf at a time. I'm working in the negative. So everything that I want to have kind of fall back, I'm slowly adding these details in. So everything that is being overlapped, I'm adding in the shadows and adding a darker value overall. Some elements that will be towards the top, I'll hardly add anything to. You'll see as I'm kind of continuing to paint. This is me painting. This is my real-time painting. I'm very slow, I'm very careful, because I do want to still capture. I went through all the trouble of drawing all of these points to everything, and I want to capture them. To add a little bit of fun, and because it's just kind of my personality and my style, I'm adding a little bit more of that red tone, just a touch, to these elements that I want to kind of highlight. So anything that I want to give a little bit more emphasis, I'm adding a little bit of that unexpected color. If you want more details about like how I like to paint leaves, I have a full video dedicated to it where I talk a little bit more about why I add certain colors in and where I would place those colors. But for now, for the sake of this video, I'm keeping it a little bit more casual. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail with these leaves. I'm just, again, I want them to be more of a garnish. I don't want them to take center stage. So I'm just kind of adding larger shapes. I'm not going to be adding, any veining, any little details. I'm just kind of trying to define the shape and the direction of each leaf. Now, the order that I am following, there is no rhyme nor reason. I'm really just going through and it's like, okay, this leaf is more backer. This one is farther back. I promise I can speak English. This leaf is farther back, so I need to make it darker. This leaf is being overlapped. Okay, so it needs to be a little bit cooler toned, a little bit darker in order to, again, kind of automatically communicate to our viewer this is farther back. Another way to communicate that space and distance to your viewers is to add less detail to things that are going to be in the background. So you'll start to notice as I'm building these leaves towards the front, slowly but surely, that each one, as it kind of comes forward, so the ones that are overlapping on top, those have a little bit more detail. I might kind of define a little bit more where the stem kind of might be. Again, I'm not adding a ton of detail here to these leaves. If you want more instruction on detailed leaves, again, I have a full video. I'll have that link down below. But I just want to define a little bit more because, again, we're trying to communicate with the viewer. We want to make it very easy for them to understand what is going on. And so a little bit more detail would, again, show the viewer it's a little bit more in front of these other leaves that you just kind of see a large dark shape. And throughout this process, I'm really just repeating myself. If there's something that, okay, this needs to be farther back, then I'm painting the negative again. I'm going really dark. And then I'm also adding kind of these red pops just for, again, a little bit of something extra. There is the symbolism of the blood of Christ kind of on these thorns, if you will, for these flowers, these leaves, this greenery, this foliage. So just kind of playing around with those different ideas. You could use purple. I do end up using a little bit of ultramarine later on to kind of tuck into the shadows a little bit and to give it a slightly different little bit of a pop. So slow and steady wins the race here. There's just a lot of repetition. We're going in, we're kind of building it. It feels a lot like a puzzle where we're just kind of building it together piece by piece. And if you discover something new, you course correct. There's a lot of different shapes in here with these more angular leaves. There's a lot of kind of wild direction, which I did intentionally. That's kind of my style. If you need help with this, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there is a download that you can purchase and use as many times as you want, whether you're painting digitally or you want to work with traditional watercolors like I'm using, or you can give it as a coloring page to your kiddos. Once your wreath is finished, I decided to move on to the flames. Now I'm using a cadmium yellow and a lemon yellow kind of mix. I ended up kind of favoring the cadmium yellow, and I'm leaving the very center part of the flame bare. So I'm leaving it white because that is going to be the very brightest spot. The very lightest color I can get is white, and I can't get any lighter than my paper with watercolors. So I am going to just leave that space blank. Now you'll see that my edges are very raw right now. I am putting down quite a bit of pigment, and then I will soften everything with a clean, damp brush to give it kind of a glow. So you see I am kind of fixing the point because I want it to be a little bit more precise. And this is my Princeton Heritage #3 round, and I'm just softening all of these edges and just kind of going around where the flame would be, kind of the hint of where that is. And I'm doing that with all these pieces. I'm again I'm washing it off, making sure there's no extra pigment. I don't want to be pulling pigment where I want that highlight to be. I was looking at a lot of different pictures of candles and flames and just trying to study what it actually looks like. And I thought this would be the best way to represent that, is to kind of bear in mind, sometimes you have to go not with what you think should be there, but what you actually see. We know in our minds that the flame is taking up that whole space, but what we actually see with our eyes is nothing, is a highlight, is a white space. Now, how do you represent that with watercolor on white piece of paper? You leave it blank. And so I decided to leave that blank. So here you can see I'm fussing with a light wash of that same tone that I just have around it, just again to kind of give it that glow. I'm not exactly sure how I would solve the problem of adding the indigo around here, but I do know I want it to have a very soft glow around it. I'm also adding a little bit of the yellow to the candle itself to kind of help it to kind of come forward. There's some reflected light here on this side of the candle, and so I'm just kind of adding a little bit of that yellow throughout. For the stems, I just mixed together whatever was left on my palette to get a nice dark color, and I'm pulling it in to where kind of the base of my candle would be. So bear in mind, try and think, okay, where's the center of your candle? For some of my candles, it's in front, and for some of them, it's kind of being overlapped by part of the candle. And so I'm trying to bear that in mind as I'm just kind of adding this around. I do want it to be nice and dark, but I didn't want to pull in a black. I wanted this to be a little bit of a softer painting. Plus, I think having the candle there would make it, even if it was a black wick, make it appear to be a little bit lighter. And that is our completed painting. I did go in off camera. I darkened the base of the candles just a little bit just by adding another wash of that same color. And just to get a little bit more contrast, I really wanted it to look like it was nestled within the wreath itself. But other than that, this was my finished painting. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something and you're able to apply that to your own artwork, whether it is painting technique or artistic symbolism. It's such a powerful tool with visual storytelling. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. Let me know what you'd like to see next down below, and I'll see you next time. Happy painting!